Hello everyone, I am Tapajit Dey, a postdoctoral researcher at LIRO, the Irish Software Research Center, and I will be discussing our work which looked at the long-term impact of peer review on post-release defects. In this project, I worked with Andrey Krutauz and Peter Rigby from Concordia University, Canada, and Dr. Audris, Mockus, my PhD advisor at the University of Tennessee. So this is the journal first paper, and it was originally published in the Empirical Software Engineering Journal. So in 1983, Edward Lemar had said, hardly anyone takes data analysis seriously, or perhaps more accurately, hardly anyone takes anyone else's data analysis seriously. So this focuses our attention to an inherent problem in terms of trusting the result of empirical studies, like the ones that investigate the relationship between code review measures and software defects. That is why replications are crucial for establishing the credibility of such studies. Only findings which are robust and replicable can be generalized and can serve as evidence-based advice to software developers. Prior works have shown that defects are both effectively and efficiently found during code review, and recent works provided qualitative evidence that reviews provide benefits beyond defect detection, such as knowledge sharing. However, can code review measures quantify the long-term impact of peer review on post-release defects? Because, as we know, such defects affect end users and the reputation of the vendor, are very costly to repair, and are a primary concern to the software industries. Well, that's where things start getting a little bit complicated. As I mentioned, there have been a lot of prior work on code reviews, which focus primarily on how effectively code reviews identify defects, how to make peer review more effective, and the non-defect finding benefits of code review. Earlier works measured how many defects were found during the review process, but did not look at the long-term impact of review on defects. The only work we found to be looking at the effect of code review in finding post-release defects was a study by McIntosh and his colleagues. In their paper, McIntosh and his colleagues studied two releases from the Qt project, one release each for the ITK and VTK projects. They employed additive models to account for any nonlinearity in the relationship between the predictors and the response variable, and concluded that code review coverage, participation, and reviewer expertise significantly impact the post-release defects. In our study, we tried to conduct a replication of their work. In our study, we conducted an internal replication by using the data on the Qt and the ITK projects that were shared by McIntosh. However, we only reported the result for the Qt project since we felt that the data on the ITK project was too small to produce meaningful statistical models. To improve external validity, we replicated the study on 6 releases of the Google Chrome project because, like Qt, it is large and primarily written in C++. In terms of the measures, we looked at 21 measures in total related to the product, the process, human factors, review participation, and reviewer expertise. The pre-processing steps involved removing redundant and highly correlated variables, which is a common practice. And we also used restricted cubic splines to account for any nonlinearity. For the full details of how we employed these techniques, please see our paper. However, the result of the replication study showed us that, first of all, nonlinear models do not yield better results than regular linear models. Log transformation of this skewed independent variable is enough to provide a reasonable model without having to add the complexity of a nonlinear model. We also found that the review measures contributed little to the performance of the model. That is, we could not reproduce the findings of the study that we replicated. The R-square values with and without review measures were almost identical. We also observed a notable inconsistency in the results across different projects and even different releases of the same project. The final result and the significance of the variables were heavily dependent on which variables were selected during the pre-processing steps, especially which variables were selected from a set of highly correlated variables. At the same time, we could reproduce the significance of metrics like the size of the component or prior defects, which are not related to code reviews. So let's take a closer look at the individual code review measures. Among them, the number of changes approved by the author themselves consistently had low significance, and the number of reviews that were conducted faster than the acceptable rate were discarded in one Qt release but was significant in another. However, it was insignificant for all Chrome releases. The typical discussion length had moderate significance for the Qt releases, but not for the Chrome ones. The number of reviewers lacking subject matter expertise produced inconsistent results for both Qt and Chrome. So in summary, the results were inconsistent for the code review measures. So now let's look at the variables that did have consistently significant effects. For the measure size of the component, we could replicate the findings of Macintosh and colleagues. It was significant for Qt and for Chrome as well. For the variable prior defects, we could partially replicate the findings. The variable was significant for our study for both Qt and Chrome, but Macintosh removed it as redundant for one Qt release. For the total number of authors as well, we could partially replicate the findings of Macintosh and his colleagues. We removed it as redundant for one Qt release, but it was significant for all other cases for us and for Macintosh's study as well. For the complete results, please see our paper. So, in summary, we found from the replication study that code review measures are neither necessary nor sufficient to create a good post-release defect prediction model. However, we also inferred that the lack of reproducibility can largely be attributed to the subjectivity in the variable selection approaches. So we needed some modeling approach that could do away with this subjectivity. Therefore, we decided to adopt the Bayesian network modeling approach, which is capable of dealing with more complex intervariable relationships. Bayesian network models are not affected by having highly correlated predictors. Those variables simply appear as connected nodes in the graph. Moreover, it can be useful for creating generative models that can help in understanding the complex interaction among all variables, unlike a predictive model, which essentially looks at how the predictors affect one response variable. Bayesian networks can also deal with non-linear relationships among variables. However, although this approach is very powerful, it is also very sensitive to small errors in the data and is prone to overfitting. Thankfully, there are a number of guidelines about using this approach which can help minimizing such problems. So here we are highlighting a few key decisions we took during the Bayesian network modeling phase. Please read our paper for the full description of our approach. We discretized all the variables due to their extremely skewed distributions using the equal frequency discretization method. For constructing the models, we used Bayesian structure search techniques with no prior assumptions to learn the model only from the data. Specifically, we used the hill climbing search with bootstrapping. We applied the method on each release of the two projects separately, as well as on the combined data for added robustness. The effect of each predictor variable on the number of post-release defects could be observed by looking at the corresponding conditional probability tables. So this is the full model of the combined Chrome and Qt data. As you can see, it's obviously quite complex. However, it is worth noting that only 3 variables among the 20 predictors directly affect the number of post-release defects. This model was found to have an accuracy of 0.83 and a Cohen's-Kappa measure of 0.45, which signifies a fair or moderate agreement. For the full details, please see our paper. So let's now narrow down our focus to the Markov blanket of the defects node. The Markov blanket is basically the set of variables containing enough information to infer a target variable. This term was first introduced by Judiapar. So the Markov blanket in this case are the variables prior defects the size of the component, and the number of minor authors, which basically means the authors who are not part of the core team of authors. It is worth mentioning that during the earlier analysis, the minor authors variable was dropped because of its high correlation with the total number of authors and the number of major authors. The total number of authors was found to be a significant one, along with the two other variables, size and prior defects, similar to what we see here. So the Bayesian network model revealed that in fact, we are wrong to subjectively drop the minor authors variable, since this is the one variable that directly affects the number of post-release defects. It is also worth noting that the three author variables, which were highly correlated, appeared as connected to each other in the graph, similar to what we had hoped for, as you can see from this picture. You can also see from this picture that the review measure, all reviews, affects the number of minor authors, which in turn affect the number of defects. So these review measures do have some indirect effects. For a detailed description of how these variables affect the number of post-release defects, please see our paper. So let's take a look at this table, which contains the summary of result for each of the Qt and Chrome releases, as well as for the combined dataset of all Qt releases, all Chrome releases, and the Qt and Chrome combined dataset. This table contains information about the variables that were in the Markov blanket of the defects node for each release, as well as the performance measures for each model, in terms of the variance explained, the accuracy, and the value of Cohen's kappa measure. So as we can see, for the two Qt releases, the variables in the Markov blanket were completely different. For the Qt50 release, the number of prior defects and the number of changes that were checked in without any discussion comments were the two variables in the Markov blanket, whereas for Qt51, the variables in the Markov blanket were the number of authors and the size of the component. Comparing the performance of these two models, we can see that the Qt50 model had a higher amount of variance explained. However, the two models performed equally well in terms of the accuracy and the kappa measure. Now, to be fair, the number of changes without any discussion is actually a code review measure. So, one of the code review measures was in fact significant for one of the Qt releases, as well as for the combined Qt dataset, which actually had the same variables in the Markov blanket for the defects node as the Qt50 model. The performance of the Qt combined model was similar to each individual model as well. However, the variable number of changes without any discussion comments was not in the Markov blanket for any of the Chrome releases. In the Chrome release 39, we had another review measure appearing in the Markov blanket of the number of post-release defects, which is the total number of reviews. Other than that, the variable that appeared in the Markov blanket of the defects node for the Chrome releases were the number of prior defects, which appeared in 4 of the 6 releases, and the total number of changes, and also the number of minor authors, that is the authors who are not part of the core team of authors, both of which appeared in the Markov blanket for 2 of the 6 releases. In terms of performance, there wasn't a lot of difference for the individual models. For the combined Chrome data, the 2 variables in the Markov blanket were the number of minor authors and the number of prior defects. Now, as we can see, there is some inconsistency among the results of the individual releases. However, each of these individual datasets are quite small, so the variation that we can see is not unexpected. Because of the limited number of observations for the individual releases, we decided that combining the datasets would be able to give us a much more reliable and robust result. When we combined the Chrome and Qt datasets, we had 3 variables in the Markov blanket of the defects node: minor authors, prior defects, and size, as you already saw in the last slide. In terms of performance, the combined model was very similar to each individual model. Okay, so now let's look at how each of these 3 predictors affect the number of post-release defects for the combined Chrome and Qt dataset. The effects are shown here using conditional probability tables, which are created for each predictor while keeping the value of every other predictor at their median values. So out of all the observations in the combined Chrome and Qt dataset, only 26.9% had at least one defect. Looking at the effect of the predictors, we can see that in general, they all had a positive effect. That is, a higher value of the predictor resulted in a higher chance of defect. For the number of prior defects, while 0 or 1 prior defects would mean that the probability of defect in that component is only about 7.4%. For modules that have over 8 prior defects, up to 1,702 prior defects, that is the maximum number that we had, the probability of finding at least one defect goes up to 54.6%, which is almost an 8-fold increase. The size of the component had a very similar effect. As you can see, once again, the probability of a defect for a component with a small size is only about 7.3%, while the probability of defect for a component of a large size goes up to over 50.3%. The minor authors variable also had a strong effect. While the components with no minor authors, the chance of a defect was around 19%. Having at least one minor author increased the chance to around 70%, which is once again a 3.5-fold increase. All the predictors for the models of each individual release also had a positive effect. For the full detailed results, please see our paper. Here, we would like to put a disclaimer that we are not performing a causal analysis. We are simply reporting what we saw from our observations. We would also like to mention that we did, in fact, discuss our findings with Dr. Shane McIntosh, the lead author of the study that we replicated. So the key takeaways from the Bayesian network modeling endeavor were that, first of all, this approach is useful in dealing with highly correlated variables and eliminating the subjective variable selection process, while preserving the explainability of the result, unlike approaches like principal component analysis. Thus, it can lead to more robust and reliable results. The sensitivity of these models can be problematic, especially while dealing with real-world data, but following the guidelines for employing these techniques can lead to stable models. We would like to encourage the community to test out our results, and we are sharing the data, the source code, and our full results through GitHub. So, in summary, we conducted a replication of an earlier study which concluded that there is a relationship between code review measures and post-release defects. We could not replicate the findings and instead saw that the code review measures do not have any direct effect, and also found that the results are highly susceptible to the subjectivity in the variable selection process. In order to eliminate the subjectivity, we decided to use Bayesian network modeling approach, which confirmed our findings that code review measures do not directly affect the number of post-release defects. When used with sufficient care, Bayesian network models can be an excellent approach for dealing with highly correlated variables, which is a common problem in software engineering research. For any follow-up questions, you can reach out to Peter Rigby at peterrigby@concordia.ca. Thank you.